My name is Lena Marsh, and I was 31 years old when a mortgage broker handed me a printout across a desk and asked me to explain a credit score of 418. I did not know what to say because I did not know what I was looking at. I had never missed a payment in my life. I had one credit card that I paid in full every month. I had my car loan, which I had been paying on time for 3 years. I was sitting in that office because I had saved for 4 years for a down payment on a house, the first house I would own, the thing I had been working toward since my first paycheck at my first real job, and I had walked in that morning feeling like a person who had done everything right. The broker, a man named Gerald who had the careful tone of someone delivering medical news, said, "Miss Marsh, there are 11 credit accounts here that appear to have been opened between 2013 and 2017. I said, "That is not possible." He turned the printout toward me. I looked at it. 11 accounts. A personal loan for $18,000, a credit card with a $12,000 limit, maxed out, a furniture line of credit, a store card, a second personal loan for $22,000, all opened while I was in college, all with my name, all with my social security number, all either in collections or carrying balances I had never known existed. I looked at that printout for a long time. Then I looked up at Gerald and I said, "I need a minute." He said, "Take all the time you need." I sat in that chair and I thought about my parents, and I thought about the 4 years I had spent in college trusting them completely, and I understood, with the particular cold clarity of a thing that cannot be taken back once it is understood, exactly what had happened to me. Before I tell you what was on that credit report, let me tell you who I was when it was happening and why I did not see it. I grew up in a small city in Ohio, the older of 2 children, in a house that was always a little tighter financially than my parents let on. My father, Dennis Marsh, worked in middle management at a manufacturing company. My mother, Carol Marsh, worked part-time at a dental office and managed the household with the particular focused energy of a woman who has decided that appearances matter and has organized her life accordingly. We were not poor, but we were not comfortable either, not in the way that comfortable actually feels from the inside, which is the absence of a low-grade financial anxiety that you learn to treat as normal. I was a good student, focused, organized, the kind of child who did her homework without being told and read the extra chapter and asked the teacher for clarification rather than guessing. I earned a partial scholarship to a state university 4 hours from home, and I enrolled at 18 with the specific excitement of someone who has spent years waiting for the moment when their real life begins. My parents drove me to campus. My mother cried. My father shook my hand and said, "We are proud of you, Lena." And I believed him completely and without reservation because at 18 I had not yet learned that pride and integrity do not always travel together, and that a person can mean one of those things entirely while betraying the other completely. College was the first time I had ever lived away from home, and it was the first time I had ever understood what it felt like to be solely responsible for myself. I had a small dorm room and a meal plan and a part-time job at the campus library that paid enough to cover my personal expenses if I was careful, which I was because careful was the only mode I knew. I called my parents every Sunday. My mother asked about my classes and my friends and whether I was eating enough. My father asked about my grades. They seemed interested and present in the way that parents seem when they are calling from a distance, and the distance means neither party has to manage the actual texture of daily life together. In my sophomore year, my mother mentioned that they were having a hard few months financially. My father's company had done a round of cuts and his hours had been reduced. I said, "I'm sorry to hear it." She said, "We might need to borrow against something temporarily, just to bridge a gap." I said, "Okay." I said, "I hope things stabilize soon." I did not ask what they were going to borrow against. I did not ask any follow-up questions at all, because I was 19 and 4 hours away and entirely focused on my own life, and because the idea that what they were borrowing against might have my name on it did not occur to me. It did not occur to me because it should not have been possible, because you don't do that to your child. Except, as I was sitting in Gerald's office at 31 looking at a credit report that proved otherwise, some parents do.
I want to be precise about what was on that credit report, because precision matters here, and the details are the thing that makes the full scope of it visible. Between January 2013, when I was a second semester freshman, and November 2017, 2 months before I graduated, 11 separate credit accounts had been opened in my name, using my social security number and my date of birth. The addresses on the accounts were my parents' home address, not my college address, which meant the statements and correspondence had been going to their house and not to me. The accounts included 2 personal installment loans totaling $40,000, 3 credit cards with combined limits of $31,000, a furniture store line of credit for $8,000, an electronics retailer card for $3,000, and 3 additional store accounts ranging from $500 to $2,000 each. The total credit extended in my name across all 11 accounts was approximately $84,000. The total balance still outstanding at the time Gerald handed me that printout was just under $50,000, the rest having been charged off or settled for less than the full amount, which is its own category of credit damage. The accounts had been variously delinquent, in collections, or carrying high utilization for years. The result was a credit score of 418, which is not just bad credit. It is the credit score of someone who appears, on paper, to have spent 4 years making consistently irresponsible financial decisions. I had made none of them, not one. I drove home from the mortgage broker's office, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for a long time. I am someone who processes by sitting still, and I have learned not to fight that about myself. What I was sitting with was the architecture of what had happened. My parents had not made one bad decision in a moment of crisis. They had opened 11 accounts over 4 years. Each account required a deliberate act, an application, a signature, or the fraudulent facsimile of one. A decision to use my identity, my name, my future credit history as a resource for their present financial needs. 11 times they had made that decision, over 4 years, while calling me every Sunday, while asking about my classes and my grades and whether I was eating enough, while driving 4 hours to attend my college graduation and sitting in the audience and clapping. I thought about graduation. My mother had cried again. My father had hugged me and said, "We are so proud of you," and I had felt, in that moment, the particular satisfaction of having arrived somewhere I had worked hard to reach. I had not known that somewhere behind that hug there were 11 credit accounts in my name, several of them already delinquent, that were quietly destroying the financial future I had just spent 4 years building toward. I sat in my car and I did not cry. I felt something colder than crying. I felt the specific feeling of a story you thought you knew revealing itself to be a different story entirely, and understanding that you have to decide what to do with that now. I called my best friend, Simone, from the parking lot. Simone and I had been friends since the first week of college, and she is the person I call when something has happened that I need to say out loud before I can think about it clearly. She answered immediately, and I told her what Gerald had showed me, the 11 accounts, the credit score, the 4 years. She was silent for a moment, and then she said, "Lena, that is identity theft." I said, "I know." She said, "By your parents?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I do not know yet." She said, "Do you want me to come over?" I said, "Not yet." I said, "I need to think first." She said, "Okay." She said, "Call me when you are done thinking and I will be there in 20 minutes. I said, "I know." I said, "Thank you." I hung up and I sat a little longer, and then I went inside and I made tea I did not want, and I sat at my kitchen table and I opened my laptop and I pulled up my credit report myself through the official site, and I looked at every single account. I read each one, the dates, the amounts, the statuses. I cross-referenced the dates against things I could remember. The first account was opened 3 weeks after I went back to campus after Christmas break my freshman year. My parents had driven me to the bus station. My mother had packed me extra food for the trip. My father had carried my bags. 3 weeks later, my name was on a loan for $18,000 that I had not taken out and would not know about for 12 years. I did not call my parents that night. I want to be clear about why. It was not because I was not ready emotionally, though I was not. It was because I understood something that I needed to honor before I did anything else, which is that what I was looking at was potentially a crime, and that crimes have a specific sequence of correct responses, and responding emotionally before I understood that sequence would put me at a disadvantage I could not afford. I had a credit score of 418. I had 4 years of fraudulent accounts in my name. I had a mortgage application that was now on hold. I had parents who had done this and did not know I knew. The advantage I had in that moment was information. They did not know I had it, and I was not going to spend that advantage on a phone call made in the first hour of shock. I made a list instead. That is what I do when things are large and I need to make them manageable. I made a list of what I needed to understand before I could decide anything. I needed to understand the legal definition of what had happened. I needed to understand my options for disputing the accounts with the credit bureaus. I needed to understand whether and how to involve law enforcement, and I needed to understand what the process of repairing this damage would actually look like, and how long it would take me in time and money and energy that I had not budgeted for. I made the list, and then I went to bed, and I lay in the dark, and I breathed steadily, and I thought about my parents, and I thought about 12 years of Sundays, and I let myself feel it for exactly as long as I needed to, before I put the feeling somewhere I could reach it later, and went to sleep.
I took a day off work. I am a project coordinator at a mid-sized logistics company, and I have a reputation for being reliable and prepared, and not missing deadlines, a reputation I have built carefully over 6 years and protect with the same focus I bring to everything I care about. Taking a day off without advance notice was genuinely uncomfortable for me, in the way that disrupting a system I have built always is, but I needed the time, and I took it. I spent the morning on the phone with a consumer law attorney named Rachel Dean, whose practice included identity theft and credit fraud cases, and who had the brisk, information-dense manner of someone who bills by the hour and respects your time because she respects her own. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What you are describing is identity theft. It does not matter that the people who did it are your parents. The law does not have a family exception for fraud." I said, "I understand that." She said, "You have several options and I want to walk you through all of them so you can make an informed decision." She said, "First, dispute the accounts with the 3 major credit bureaus, which you can do independently and which will trigger an investigation by each bureau. Second, file a report with the Federal Trade Commission, which creates an official document you can use with creditors requesting account closure and balance removal. Third, file a police report, which is where the criminal dimension enters. Fourth, pursue civil litigation against the individuals who opened the accounts." She said, "These are not mutually exclusive. You can do all of them." I said, "Tell me about each one." Rachel Dean spent 90 minutes walking me through the landscape of what I was dealing with and what I could do about it. By the end of that call, I had a legal pad covered in notes and a clearer picture of the road ahead than I had had when I woke up. Here is what I understood. The credit bureau dispute process was my first and most immediate step. I could file disputes on all 11 accounts simultaneously, flagging each one as fraudulent. The bureaus were required by law to investigate and respond within 30 to 45 days. If the accounts were confirmed as fraudulent, they would be removed from my credit report and my score would begin recovering. This was not a fast process. Full recovery from this level of damage typically took 1 to 3 years, depending on the specifics. The FTC report was straightforward, and I could do it online. It did not involve law enforcement directly, but created an official document that creditors were legally required to honor when I sent it to them, requesting account closure and balance removal. The police report was the step with the most consequences, for me and for my parents, and Rachel was careful to explain that without minimizing it. She said, filing a police report against your parents means potentially initiating a criminal process against them. She said, it is your right. She said, it is also a decision with implications for your family that only you can weigh. I said, I understand. She said, you do not need to decide today. I said, I know, but I think I already know what I am going to do. Before I decided anything about police reports or attorneys or the sequence of legal steps, I decided I needed to talk to my parents, not because I owed them the warning, though I thought about that, because I needed to look at them and hear them explain it and understand from their own words what they had told themselves about what they were doing for 4 years. Rachel Dean had advised me not to speak to them with counsel present once I decided to pursue legal remedies. I understood that advice, and I respected it, and I did not entirely follow it, because I'm a person who needs to understand things directly and firsthand before I can act on them with full conviction. I needed to hear it from them. I drove to my parents' house on a Saturday morning. I had not told them I was coming. My mother opened the door in her weekend clothes, and her face did the thing it does when she's surprised but covering it, a quick recalibration behind the eyes. She said, Lena, we did not know you were coming. I said, I know. I said, I need to talk to you both. She stepped back to let me in. My father was in the kitchen. He looked up when I came in and said, hey, what a nice surprise. I sat down at the kitchen table where I had sat for every meal of my childhood, and I put the credit report printout on the table between us, and I said, I applied for a mortgage this week. And then I waited.
My father looked at the printout. My mother looked at my father. The silence that followed was not the silence of people who do not understand what they are looking at. It was the silence of people who understand exactly what they are looking at and are calculating how to respond to it. I had been watching my parents my entire life, and I know the difference between their confusion and their performance of confusion, and what I was watching was the second thing. My father picked up the printout. He looked at it for longer than he needed to if he was seeing it for the first time. Then he set it down, and he said, Where did you get this? I said, From the mortgage broker who told me my credit score is $418. My mother made a sound. My father said, Lena. I said, do not. I said, I am not here to have you explain to me what I already know. I am here because I need to hear you say it. There was another silence. Then my father said, we were in a very difficult place. I said, when? He said, for a few years when you were in college, your mother's hours got cut and the mortgage was behind, and I had some medical bills, and we just... He stopped. I said, and? He said, we thought we could pay it all back before you would ever need to worry about it. I looked at him. I said, you thought you could use my name and my credit for 4 years and pay it all back, and I would never know? He looked at the table. He said, we did not think it would get this bad. I said, it got to $418, Dad. 11 accounts, nearly $50,000 still outstanding. It got exactly this bad. My mother started crying. I want to record that because it matters, not because it changed anything I had decided, but because I watched it and made a conscious choice about what to do with it. My mother's tears have always been her most effective tool in any difficult conversation, and I do not say that to be cruel. I say it because it is true, and because I had spent 31 years allowing those tears to redirect conversations that needed to go somewhere uncomfortable. I was not going to allow that today. I said, Mom. She looked at me. I said, I need you to stay with me in this conversation. She wiped her eyes. She nodded.
I said, I need to understand the full scope of what happened. I need to know every account, every amount, every date you can remember. My father said, Lena, we are sorry. I said, I know you are. I said, I believe that, and I also need the information. He looked at my mother. Then he got up and went to the bedroom and came back with a manila folder. He put it on the table. I looked at it. It was thick. I opened it. Inside were statements and payment histories and collection notices organized chronologically going back to 2013. They had kept records. They had kept organized records of every account they had opened in my name. I looked at that folder and I understood that this had not been a panicked improvisation. It had been managed, tracked, filed. They had known exactly what they were doing every single step of the way. I took the folder. My father did not object. I think he understood that objecting was not something he had the standing to do. I spent 2 hours at that kitchen table going through every document in it, while my parents sat across from me and answered my questions when I asked them, and stayed quiet when I did not. What I learned from those 2 hours filled in every gap between the credit report and the story I had been told about my childhood. The first account, the personal loan for $18,000 opened in January 2013, had been used to pay the mortgage arrears that had accumulated over the previous year. The second account, a credit card opened 3 months later, had been used for general household expenses. By the time I was a junior in college, they were using new accounts to make minimum payments on old ones, the particular financial spiral that starts as a solution and becomes its own problem. By the time I was a senior, they had accounts in collections and were opening new ones to cover the shortfall. The last account, a store card opened 2 months before my graduation, had been used to buy the outfit my mother wore to the ceremony. I read that one twice. The outfit she wore to watch me graduate, the ceremony she cried at, had been purchased on a fraudulent account in my name. I set that document down, and I looked at my mother, and I did not say what I was thinking, because what I was thinking was too large for the moment, and I needed to keep the moment manageable. I left my parents' house with the folder and drove home and called Simone. She came over within 20 minutes as promised and sat on my couch and listened while I went through everything, and she did not interrupt and she did not offer commentary until I was finished. When I finished, she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, I am going to dispute all 11 accounts with the credit bureaus, I am going to file an FTC identity theft report, and I am going to give my parents 30 days to present me with a plan for repaying the outstanding balances before I decide what to do about a police report. She said, "That is very measured of you." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, I am not okay in the way that okay means comfortable or at peace. I am okay in the way that okay means functional and clear about what needs to happen next. She said, "That is a very Lena answer." I said, "I know that too." She stayed for 3 hours, and we did not talk about my parents the whole time, which was exactly what I needed, because there is only so long you can hold a thing directly before you need to set it down and look at something else for a while. She left at 9. I sat at my table and started drafting the dispute letters, one for each bureau, methodical and precise, the way I approach everything that matters to me, which is to say, with the full weight of my attention and none of the shortcuts that feel efficient but cost you later.
I sent the dispute letters to all 3 bureaus the following Monday, certified mail, with copies of the FTC identity theft report I had filed over the weekend, and documentation of every account I was flagging as fraudulent. Rachel Dean had reviewed my letters and confirmed they were correct. I had also sent formal letters to each of the 11 creditors directly, again certified mail, notifying them that the accounts had been opened fraudulently, referencing the FTC report and requesting that they cease collection activity and remove the accounts from my credit file pending investigation. This was the official beginning of a process that Rachel had told me would take months and that I needed to approach with patience and documentation. I am good at documentation. I created a folder on my computer and a physical folder in my filing cabinet, and I logged every action, every response, every date in both.
I am my mother's daughter in that one specific way, which is the way that the folder on that kitchen table had demonstrated clearly. We are both people who keep records. The difference is what we keep records of and why. That week, I also called my parents and told them I had retained an attorney and that they had 30 days to come back to me with a concrete repayment proposal for the outstanding balances. My father said, "We want to make this right, Lena." I said, "I know you do." I said, "Prove it." He said, "We will." I said, 30 days. Then I hung up and went back to my documentation folder and added the date and the content of the call to the log. The 30 days were among the stranger months I have lived through, because on the surface, my life looked exactly the same as it had before the mortgage broker handed me that printout. I went to work, I managed my projects, I had dinner with Simone twice. I called my parents on Sundays, which I kept doing because stopping would have signaled something I was not ready to signal, and because the calls were brief and informational, and I could manage them without it costing me too much. My parents were careful on those calls, quieter than usual. My mother asked about my week with the particular anxious attentiveness of someone who is aware they are on thin ground. My father asked about work. Nobody mentioned the folder or the accounts or the 30-day deadline which I had set and which was counting down in the back of every conversation we had, like a clock neither party was acknowledging out loud. Meanwhile, the credit bureau investigations were underway. I had received acknowledgement letters from all 3 bureaus within the required timeframe. Rachel had advised me that the investigation process would involve the bureaus contacting each creditor to verify the account details, and that the creditors, once presented with an identity theft report, had their own obligations under federal law. Some accounts would be resolved faster than others. The personal loans were the most complex because the amounts were largest and the documentation trail was most extensive. The store cards were simpler. One of them was removed from my report within 3 weeks of my dispute. That was the first piece of concrete progress, and I noted it in my log and felt for the first time since Gerald's office something that was adjacent to relief. My parents called me on day 28, not Sunday, a Thursday evening which broke the pattern in a way I noticed immediately. My father's voice had the quality it gets when he has prepared what he is going to say, a slight formality that does not suit him and that I have always been able to detect. He said, "Your mother and I have been talking, and we want to come and see you this weekend. We have a proposal." I said, "Okay." I said, "Saturday afternoon." He said, "We will be there." They arrived at 2 o'clock on Saturday. My mother had brought food, a container of the pasta she makes for occasions when she needs something to do with her hands while difficult things are being said. I let them in. We sat at my kitchen table. My mother put the pasta in the fridge and sat down and folded her hands and looked at me with the expression of someone who has rehearsed for this moment and is hoping the rehearsal was enough. My father put a folder on the table, a different folder than the one he had handed me at their house, thinner, newer. I looked at it. He said, "We have spoken to a financial advisor and to a debt consolidation service." He opened the folder. Inside was a repayment plan. I picked it up and read it. It was a 5-year plan to repay the outstanding balances on all 11 accounts, structured as a personal loan they would take out against their house, using their home equity, not mine, to fund the repayment. Monthly payments made directly to the creditors or to me as an intermediary, a signed acknowledgement of what had happened, and a letter, handwritten, from both of them.
I read the repayment plan carefully, the way I read everything that matters, which is slowly and with attention to what is not said as much as is. The numbers were correct. The timeline was aggressive but plausible given their equity position. Rachel Dean had told me what a reasonable repayment structure would look like, and this was within the range of reasonable. I set the plan down, and I picked up the handwritten letter. It was 2 pages, front and back, in my father's handwriting, with my mother's additions in the margins, the way they have always written things together, one of them drafting and the other annotating, a habit of 40 years of marriage. I read it twice. I am not going to reproduce it here in full because some things belong only to the people they were written for, but I will tell you what it contained because it is relevant to understanding what happened next. It contained an admission, clear and specific, of every account they had opened and why, and what they had told themselves at the time. It contained an acknowledgement that those justifications were not sufficient and had never been sufficient. It contained the sentence, "We knew it was wrong, and we did it anyway, because we were afraid, and we chose our fear over your future, and that is not something we can undo, but it is something we intend to spend however long it takes making right." It contained my father's description of the moment he had walked out of their bedroom with that folder, how he had known for years it was there, and hoped he would never have to show it to me. And it contained my mother writing in the margin next to that sentence, in her handwriting, "I am so sorry, Lena. I am so sorry." I sat with the letter for a long time after I finished reading it. My parents sat across from me and did not speak, which was the correct instinct, and I credited them for it. Silence was what the moment required, and they gave it to me. What I was sitting with was not simple. It was not the clean decision that revenge stories tend to present as available, the moment where justice arrives fully formed and the wronged party knows exactly what to do with it. What I was sitting with was the letter my father had written, and the folder he had kept for years, and the outfit my mother had worn to my graduation, and the way she had cried. All of those things were simultaneously true. The harm was real and documented, and had cost me in ways I was still calculating. The remorse in that letter also read as real, not performed, not strategic, but the genuine reckoning of 2 people who had spent years not looking directly at what they had done, and were now looking at it fully, and finding it as bad as they had suspected, and worse than they had allowed themselves to think. I said, "I am going to take this to my attorney." I said, "If she confirms that the terms are legally sound and fully enforceable, I am prepared to accept this plan and use it as the basis of a formal agreement." My father said, "Whatever you need." My mother said, "We will sign anything." I said, "I know." I said, "I also need you to understand that my decision about whether to file a police report is separate from this agreement, and I have not made that decision yet." My father nodded. He said, "We understand." He meant it. I could see that he meant it. It did not make anything easier, but it mattered.
Rachel Dean reviewed the repayment plan and confirmed that it was legally viable and that with the right formal structure, a notarized agreement with specific terms and consequences for default, it would be enforceable in civil court. She drafted the formal agreement over the following week, incorporating the repayment schedule, the acknowledgement of fraudulent account opening, and a clause specifying that any default would result in immediate civil litigation. She also included a clause requiring my parents to cooperate fully with any credit bureau investigations and to provide documentation to creditors as needed to support the account removal process. My parents signed it without objection or negotiation. My father signed first. My mother signed beneath him. Rachel witnessed it. I signed my portion. Rachel filed copies. I kept an original in my filing cabinet next to the documentation log. That was month 2. In month 3, the credit bureau investigations began producing results. 2 more accounts were removed, then 3 more the following month. The personal loans were taking longer because the creditors were pushing back, requesting additional documentation, which is standard but frustrating. Rachel handled those creditors directly. I handled the smaller accounts myself because I had learned enough about the process by then to navigate it without handholding, and because handling it myself felt important, felt like a form of agency in a situation where my agency had been taken from me without my knowledge for 4 years.
I want to talk about what this cost me that is harder to quantify than the credit score or the outstanding balances or the legal fees, which were themselves significant on a project coordinator's salary. The mortgage I had been trying to get was on hold indefinitely. The house I had been looking at, a 2-bedroom on a quiet street that I had visited twice and had started to imagine my life in, went to another buyer 6 weeks after Gerald's office. I found out on a Tuesday, and I sat with it for an evening, and then I filed it in the category of things I could not change and moved forward, because moving forward is the only direction available, and standing still in grief is a luxury I could not afford that month. The harder cost was the restructuring of the story I had told myself about my family. I am 31 years old. I have 31 years of memories that have my parents in them, Sunday dinners and school plays, and the way my father taught me to drive, and the way my mother sat with me when I was sick, and the particular texture of being known by people who have known you your whole life. All of those things were real. None of them stopped being real because of what was in that manila folder. But they were now things I held differently, at a slight angle, with the awareness that the people at the center of them had also been capable of something that took me years to understand the full cost of. Holding both of those things is work, ongoing, daily work. I do not think that work ever fully ends. I think you just get better at carrying it. Simone asked me one evening, about 4 months into the process, whether I had forgiven them. I thought about that question seriously before I answered, because it deserved seriousness. I said, I do not think forgiveness is the right frame for where I am right now. She said, what is the right frame? I said, I think the right frame is accountability. I think what I needed from them was not forgiveness, which is something I give, but accountability, which is something they do. I said, the repayment plan is accountability. The signed acknowledgement is accountability. Showing up at my kitchen table with a folder and a letter instead of a lawyer and a denial is accountability. I said, what I am working on is separate from that. What I am working on is what my relationship with them looks like going forward, which is a different question from whether they are being held responsible, and one that I am not ready to answer yet. Simone said, that is a very considered position. I said, I have had a lot of time to think about it. She said, are you angry? I said, yes. I said, I am angry in the specific way you are angry when people you trusted made choices they knew were wrong and made them anyway, and the cost of those choices landed on you. I said, I do not think the anger is going away soon, and I am not trying to make it. I think the anger is information, and I am using it to make decisions, and when I have made all the decisions I need to make, I think it will have somewhere to go. She said, that sounds right. I said, it's the best I have. The police report question stayed open longer than anything else. Rachel had told me I could file at any point, and that the statute of limitations gave me time. I had not filed yet because I had not decided, and I had not decided because I was honest with myself about the fact that the decision was genuinely hard and deserved the time I was giving it. Filing a police report against my parents meant potentially initiating a criminal fraud investigation that could result in charges, prosecution, and consequences I could not fully predict or control once the process was in motion. The repayment agreement meant there was a civil resolution in place that was real and enforceable. My credit was being repaired account by account. The practical harm was being addressed. What the police report would address was something different, the formal legal acknowledgement by the state that a crime had been committed. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about what that acknowledgement would give me that I didn't already have. I thought about what it would cost my parents beyond what the repayment plan was already costing them. I thought about whether those costs were proportional and whether proportionality was even the correct measure. I thought about who I wanted to be in this situation, not as a performance, not for anyone else, but for myself, the self that would have to live with whatever I decided long after the situation itself had resolved. I thought, Rachel's question about whether I was comfortable, I thought, comfortable is not the word. I thought, right is the word, and I was not yet sure which path was right.
I called my Aunt Patricia, my father's sister, who is the person in my family I trust most completely, and who has always been able to say difficult things to me with both honesty and care. She lives in another state, and we speak every few months, and she has always known my parents more clearly than most people do, with the particular clear-eyed perspective of a sibling who loves without illusion. I did not call her to have her make the decision for me. I called her because I needed to hear the perspective of someone who had known my father his whole life, and who would not either defend him reflexively or condemn him reflexively, but would tell me what she actually thought. She listened to everything. When I finished, she said, "I am not surprised." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Your father has always done this. When things get hard, he finds the nearest available solution without fully thinking through who it costs." She said, "I love him, he is my brother, but this is who he is when he is frightened, and he is frightened a lot more than he lets on." I said, "Does that change what they did?" She said, "No, it explains it." She said, "Lena, what are you actually asking me?" I said, "I am asking whether I should file the police report." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think the question is not what they deserve. I think the question is what you need. What do you need from this situation that you do not already have?" I sat with that for the rest of the call, and for several days after it. What did I need that I did not already have? I made a list, because lists are how I think. I needed my credit repaired. That was in process. I needed the financial harm addressed. The repayment plan was in place. I needed a formal acknowledgement of what had happened. I had it, signed and notarized. I needed to understand why it had happened. I had sat at their kitchen table and gotten that, imperfectly but genuinely. I needed to know they understood the full cost of it. The letter suggested they did. What was left? What I kept coming back to was the future. Not my parents' future, but mine. What I needed for my future was to be able to trust the structure of my own life, to know that the foundation I was building was not vulnerable to being used without my knowledge again. The repayment agreement protected me financially, but what protected me going forward in terms of the relationship, in terms of whether I could have any ongoing connection with my parents that was not built on the pretense that what had happened was less serious than it was? I understood that the police report would not answer that question. The police report was about the past. The question I actually needed to answer was about what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with my parents going forward, and on what terms. That was not a legal question. It was a personal one, and it was the one I had been circling for months without naming it directly. I named it that evening, and naming it made the decision about the police report clearer, though not easier. I told Rachel I was not going to file a police report. I want to be precise about why, because the reason matters, and I do not want it misread. I was not letting my parents off the hook. I was not deciding that what they did was acceptable or forgivable in the sense of consequence-free. I was deciding that the consequences that were already in place, the repayment plan, the signed acknowledgement, the legal agreement, the ongoing credit repair process, the irrevocable change in the nature of our relationship, were the consequences that served my future, rather than the additional consequence of a criminal process that would consume years of my life, cost significant additional money, and produce an outcome I could not control or predict. I was making a choice based on what I needed going forward, and not on what they deserved in the abstract. Those are different calculations, and I made mine deliberately and clearly, and I am at peace with it. Rachel said she understood. She said, "It is your decision to make." I said, "I know." She said, "The agreement is fully enforceable regardless." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Call me if anything changes." I said I would. I drove home and I sat at my table and I logged the decision in my documentation folder, date and rationale, the way I log everything that matters.
And then I closed the folder and made dinner and watched something on television that I cannot remember now and went to bed and slept better than I had in months. Month 6 brought the most significant credit bureau results so far. The 2 personal loans, the largest and most damaging accounts, were both removed from my credit report following investigations in which the creditors were unable to produce documentation of a valid, authorized signature. This was the outcome Rachel anticipated, given the fraudulent nature of the accounts, but anticipating an outcome and receiving confirmation of it are different things, and when I got the letters from the bureaus, I sat with them for a long time. The removal of those 2 accounts alone moved my credit score from 418 to approximately 560, which is still not good, but is categorically different. It is the difference between a score that makes mortgage approval essentially impossible and a score that makes it difficult but workable with the right loan type and the right timeline. I called Gerald, the mortgage broker, and told him what was happening. He said, "Call me when you are in the high 6s. I said, "I will." I put that in my log too. Target 680. Timeline, best estimate, 12 to 18 additional months. Steps between here and there, 7 accounts still being disputed, 4 already removed, ongoing monitoring, continued perfect payment history on my legitimate accounts. I could see the path. It was long, and it was not the path I had planned to be on at 31, but it was visible, and I was on it, and I was moving forward, and that was enough for that day.
My parents and I found a new shape for our relationship over those months, slowly and without anyone formally declaring that we were doing so. The Sunday calls continued. They were different. My mother stopped filling the silences with chatter and started leaving room in them, which was a form of respect she had not previously offered me in our conversations. My father started asking questions he had not asked before. Real ones about my work and my plans and what I was thinking about, not the surface questions of someone maintaining a habit, but the questions of someone who has understood that they do not actually know their daughter as well as they thought they did, and is trying to change that. I did not make it easy for them, which I think was correct. Easy was not what the situation warranted. But I did not make it impossible either, because impossible would have required a degree of sustained anger that I was not willing to make the center of my life. I had too many other things to build. I went to their house for Thanksgiving that year. It was the first time I had been back since the day I put the credit report on the kitchen table. My mother had cooked everything I liked. My father had opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for a special occasion, which was an odd way to mark the occasion, but was also, I understood, his way of saying, "This is important to me. You being here is important to me," which was something he could not say directly and said sideways instead. We ate and we talked, and it was not comfortable. It was real. I am choosing real. The remaining accounts were removed from my credit report over the following 8 months. The process was not linear. 2 accounts were removed quickly. One creditor disputed my identity theft claim and required additional documentation and a letter from Rachel before they complied. One account had already been sold to a collections agency, which required a separate dispute process with the new holder. Each one required attention and follow-through, and the kind of persistent, organized effort that is not dramatic but is the actual work of rebuilding something that was taken from you. I logged every step. I kept every letter. I responded to every request for documentation within 48 hours, because speed matters in these processes, and I had learned that the creditor who gets a complete response on Monday processes it faster than the creditor who gets a partial one on Thursday. By month 11, I had 9 of the 11 accounts removed. By month 14, I had all 11. The day the last account was removed, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at my updated credit report and read my own name at the top of it and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing being fully correct that had been wrong for a long time. The score that day was 641.
Not 680 yet, but close. Getting there. My path.
My parents made their first 6 repayment installments on time and in full. I know this because Rachel's office received confirmation of each one and forwarded it to me, and I logged each one. I did not call my parents to acknowledge the payments. The payments were not a favor. They were an obligation under a legal agreement, the minimum required, and thanking someone for meeting a minimum they created through fraud seemed like the wrong signal to send. What I did do was, around month 8 of the repayment plan, agree to have a longer conversation with my parents about what had happened, not about the legal mechanics of it, which we had covered, but about the why of it in a deeper sense than my father's initial explanation at the kitchen table. I wanted that conversation because I thought I needed it for myself, and because I thought they needed it too. We sat in their living room on a Sunday afternoon, and I asked them to tell me the whole story from the beginning, not just the financial crisis version, but the full version, the one that included what they had told themselves at each step, what they had believed about whether I would find out, what they had believed about whether it was actually wrong. My father talked for a long time. My mother added things he left out. What emerged was not a story about villains. It was a story about 2 people who had made a catastrophic decision while frightened, and then been too afraid of what facing it would cost them to stop. Each account was a step further in a direction they knew was wrong and could not figure out how to reverse. That is not an excuse, but it is the truth, and I needed the truth more than I needed the excuse to stay angry. There is a particular thing that happens when you get a full accounting from someone who has wronged you. It does not make the wrong smaller. What it does is make it comprehensible, which is different and, in some ways, more useful. I could not understand how my parents had done this for 4 years without ever telling me. After that Sunday afternoon conversation, I understood, not in a way that made it acceptable, but in a way that made it human. They had been afraid. They had been in over their heads. They had made one bad decision and then made another to cover it, and had kept going because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing, which is a logic that makes no sense from the outside and a kind of terrible sense from the inside of the situation. I have thought a lot about that. I have thought about the moments in my own life where I have continued doing something I knew was not right because stopping required an admission I was not ready to make. I have not done anything of this magnitude, but I have done smaller versions of that same thing, and I think most people have. This does not make what my parents did okay. It makes them people, flawed, frightened, capable of serious harm, and also of the genuine reckoning they eventually brought to my kitchen table. Both things. I keep coming back to both things. I do not think there is a version of this story where only one of those things is true. Month 16. My credit score hit 683. I called Gerald. He said, "Now we're talking." He pulled my report and reviewed it and said, "All 11 disputed accounts are gone. Your payment history on your legitimate accounts is clean. Your utilization is good. Your score is 683 and trending up." He said, "I can work with this." We met the following week and restarted the mortgage process. This time, I sat across from him with a different feeling than the first time. The first time, I had arrived as someone who believed everything was in order. This time, I arrived as someone who had spent 16 months learning exactly what was in order and why and how it had gotten there. That knowledge was not comfortable, but it was mine in a way that the naive confidence of the first visit had not been. Gerald ran the numbers. Given my income and my down payment, which I had continued saving and which had grown in the 16 months since the first application, I qualified for a loan that would cover the kind of house I had been looking for. He gave me a pre-approval letter. I folded it and put it in my bag and drove home and called Simone. She screamed. I laughed. It was a good laugh, the kind that has a lot of other things in it. I found the house in month 18. Not the specific house I had lost when the first buyer got it, but another one, on a different street, that turned out to be better in ways I could not have anticipated when I was looking at the first one. 3 bedrooms, a yard with an established garden that the previous owner had spent years on, a kitchen with good light, a neighborhood where I could hear children playing in the evenings.
I walked through it with my realtor on a Tuesday afternoon and stood in the kitchen in the good light and thought, this is it. The offer was accepted on Friday. I called my parents on Sunday and told them. My mother cried. My father was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Lena, we are so proud of you. And this time, unlike the graduation, unlike every time before, I believed that pride and the integrity of the person feeling it were in the same room. He had earned the right to say that to me again, not fully, not yet, but incrementally, one payment and one honest conversation at a time. I said, thank you, Dad. I meant it. Not as the declaration of resolution that it might sound like, as an acknowledgement of where we were, which was in the middle of a process that was going to take a long time and had already come further than I had expected. The closing was on a Thursday morning. I wore the same gray blazer I had bought for the sentencing hearing in the Nadia Callum story. No, wait, let me correct that. I wore a navy blazer I had bought specifically for this occasion, because this occasion deserved its own blazer. I sat across from the closing attorney and signed the documents, my actual signature, the one I have always written, the capital L that I developed in middle school and have never changed. Every time I signed my name, I thought about what it meant to sign your own name on your own documents for your own property, and how I had not known until 16 months ago that you could have that right violated so quietly and for so long without knowing it was happening. I signed the last page. The attorney handed me the keys. 2 keys on a plain ring. I held them in my palm and thought about everything that had gone into that moment. The 4 years of saving, and the one morning in Gerald's office, and the 11 accounts, and the documentation log, and Rachel's calm, billing-by-the-hour voice, and Simone showing up in 20 minutes, and my Aunt Patricia asking what I needed, and my parents at my kitchen table with a folder and a letter. All of that was in those keys. I put them in my bag and walked out into the afternoon and called Simone, and she screamed again, and I laughed again, and this time it was a little cleaner. My parents came to see the house the weekend after I moved in. I had invited them, deliberately, not because it was easy, and not because everything was resolved, but because I had decided that the relationship I wanted with them going forward, if there was going to be a relationship, required me to make choices that reflected who I wanted to be, and not only what had been done to me. Inviting them to see my house was that kind of choice. My mother brought food. Of course she did. My father brought a small plant for the garden, which was either the most thoughtful thing or a coincidence, and I chose to take it as the former. They walked through the house, and my mother said it was beautiful, and she meant it, and my father stood in the kitchen in the good light and said, Lena, you built this. And he was not talking only about the house. I said, I know. We had lunch at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, in my house, that was fully and legally and correctly mine in every document that mattered. It was not an easy afternoon. It was not a pretend nothing happened afternoon. It was an honest afternoon. 3 people who had been through something serious together, trying to figure out what the next chapter of knowing each other looked like. I do not have the full answer yet. I think that is okay. I think the full answer is the kind of thing that gets built over time and not declared in a single afternoon. I found the house in month 18. Not the specific house I had lost when the first buyer got it, but another one, on a different street, that turned out to be better in ways I could not have anticipated when I was looking at the first one. 3 bedrooms, a yard with an established garden that the previous owner had spent years on, a kitchen with good light, a neighborhood where I could hear children playing in the evenings. I walked through it with my realtor on a Tuesday afternoon and stood in the kitchen in the good light and thought, this is it. The offer was accepted on Friday. I called my parents on Sunday and told them. My mother cried. My father was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Lena, we are so proud of you. And this time, unlike the graduation, unlike every time before, I believed that pride and the integrity of the person feeling it were in the same room. He had earned the right to say that to me again,
Not fully, not yet, but incrementally, one payment and one honest conversation at a time. I said, "Thank you, Dad." I meant it. Not as the declaration of resolution that it might sound like, as an acknowledgement of where we were, which was in the middle of a process that was going to take a long time and had already come further than I had expected. The closing was on a Thursday morning. I wore the same gray blazer I had bought for the sentencing hearing in the Nadia Callum story. No, wait, let me correct that. I wore a navy blazer I had bought specifically for this occasion, because this occasion deserved its own blazer. I sat across from the closing attorney and signed the documents, my actual signature, the one I have always written, the capital L that I developed in middle school and have never changed. Every time I signed my name, I thought about what it meant to sign your own name on your own documents for your own property, and how I had not known until 16 months ago that you could have that right violated so quietly and for so long without knowing it was happening. I signed the last page. The attorney handed me the keys. 2 keys on a plain ring. I held them in my palm and thought about everything that had gone into that moment. The 4 years of saving, and the one morning in Gerald's office, and the 11 accounts, and the documentation log, and Rachel's calm, billing-by-the-hour voice, and Simone showing up in 20 minutes, and my Aunt Patricia asking what I needed, and my parents at my kitchen table with a folder and a letter. All of that was in those keys. I put them in my bag and walked out into the afternoon and called Simone, and she screamed again, and I laughed again, and this time it was a little cleaner. My parents came to see the house the weekend after I moved in. I had invited them, deliberately, not because it was easy, and not because everything was resolved, but because I had decided that the relationship I wanted with them going forward, if there was going to be a relationship, required me to make choices that reflected who I wanted to be, and not only what had been done to me. Inviting them to see my house was that kind of choice. My mother brought food. Of course she did. My father brought a small plant for the garden, which was either the most thoughtful thing or a coincidence, and I chose to take it as the former. They walked through the house, and my mother said it was beautiful, and she meant it, and my father stood in the kitchen in the good light and said, "Lena, you built this," and he was not talking only about the house. I said, "I know." We had lunch at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, in my house, that was fully and legally and correctly mine in every document that mattered. It was not an easy afternoon. It was not a pretend nothing happened afternoon. It was an honest afternoon. 3 people who had been through something serious together, trying to figure out what the next chapter of knowing each other looked like. I do not have the full answer yet. I think that is okay. I think the full answer is the kind of thing that gets built over time and not declared in a single afternoon.
The repayment plan is in its 3rd year. My parents have not missed a payment. I check the log every month when Rachel's office sends confirmation, and every month the log shows the same thing. Payment received, on time, in full. My father has started calling me more often than just Sundays, not dramatically more, once or twice extra per month. The calls are different than they used to be. He asks real questions, and he listens to the answers, and he does not rush toward the end of the conversation the way he used to when conversations that required actual attention made him uncomfortable. I think about what my Aunt Patricia said about him, that he is frightened more than he lets on, and I think about the folder he kept for years, and the letter he wrote, and the repayment plan he brought to my kitchen table, and I think, he is trying. I can see the trying. It does not undo anything, but it is real, and I am choosing to let real matter. My mother is harder to read. She has always communicated in layers, and the layers have not disappeared. But the crying that used to redirect conversations has become less strategic, which is to say, it now appears at the moments where it is earned rather than the moments where it is useful. I think she is working on something in herself. I think the weight of what they did has landed on her in ways she is still processing. I am not responsible for her processing, but I can witness it without turning away, which I think is the appropriate version of care for where we are.
Simone asked me recently whether I thought my parents were good people. It's a version of the question she has been asking me in different forms for 2 years, and I have given her different versions of the same answer each time. This time I said, I think they are people. I think good and bad are categories that are less useful than we want them to be when we are trying to understand someone we know well. I said, I think they did a genuinely bad thing. I think they have responded to being caught in a way that suggests they understand it was bad and are committed to addressing it. I think neither of those things fully cancels the other. I think the question that actually matters to me is not whether they are good people, but whether the relationship I have with them going forward can be built on something honest. And I think the answer to that is yes, but slowly, and with the understanding that trust at the level I had before is not available, and may never be fully available again, and that the relationship will have to be built on something different, something that accounts for what I now know about who they are under pressure. Simone said, That is the most nuanced thing you have ever said about them. I said, I have had a lot of time to work up to it. She said, Are you happy? I thought about the house, and the good light in the kitchen, and the garden, and the keys in my bag on the closing day, and the documentation log in my filing cabinet that now also contained the record of every account successfully removed and every payment received. I said, Yes. I said, I think I actually am. I went back to Gerald's office last month, not to apply for anything. I went because I wanted to sit across from him and show him my credit report and let him see what it looked like now. He pulled it up and looked at it and said, That is an 741. I said, I know. He said, That is a very good score. I said, I know that too. He said, What happened? I said, I disputed 11 fraudulent accounts, filed an FTC identity theft report, retained an attorney, documented every step of the process, and waited. He said, Just like that? I said, Just like that, over about 18 months. He said, And the people who opened the accounts? I said, They're repaying the balances under a formal legal agreement. He said, Are they family? I said, Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm sorry that happened to you. I said, Thank you. I said, I'm less sorry than I was. He said, That sounds like the right direction. I said, I think it is. I shook his hand and I left, and I drove home to my house, my actual house, with the keys on the ring and the garden and the good light. And I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about the first time I had sat at a table trying to understand what had happened to me and how far that table was from this one. Same posture, same documentation habit, completely different foundation. That felt like something worth sitting with, so I sat with it. There are things I would tell someone who was in the early hours of what I was in, someone who has just had a piece of information handed to them that changes the structure of something they thought was stable. I would tell them to sit with it before they move, not for too long, but long enough. I would tell them that the first call should be to someone who can tell them what their options are and not to the person who caused the situation, because information is an advantage, and advantages spent in the first hour of shock are advantages spent badly. I would tell them that the anger they feel is valid and is information and can be used as fuel for the decisions that need to be made rather than expressed in ways that make the decisions harder. I would tell them that the question of forgiveness is one they do not need to answer quickly, and that anyone who tells them they need to answer it quickly is prioritizing someone else's comfort over their own process. I would tell them that rebuilding takes longer than you want it to and arrives in smaller increments than the story you have in your head about what recovery looks like, and that the small increments are the actual thing, not placeholders for the big moment, and that recognizing them as the actual thing is how you get through the in-between. And I would tell them that you can come through something this serious and still have a life that is good. I'm evidence of that. Not perfect, not without the marks of what happened, but good, genuinely good.
My name is Lena Marsh, and I was 31 years old when a mortgage broker handed me a printout with a credit score of 418 and 11 accounts I had never opened, and I understood in that moment that the foundation I thought I was standing on had a hole in it that had been put there by the people I trusted most. I am 33 now, and I am sitting at my kitchen table in my house, the one with the good light and the garden and the keys on the plain ring, and my credit score is 741, and my documentation log is in my filing cabinet, and Rachel's office sends me a payment confirmation every month, and I sit at this table and I add it to the log, and I close the folder, and I make coffee, and I look at the garden through the window. My parents are 31 payments into a 60-month plan. They have not missed one. I do not know yet what our relationship looks like at the end of those 60 months. I do not know what it looks like 5 years from now or 10. I know what it looks like today, which is honest and careful and nothing like it was before, and something that might over time become something I'm glad I chose not to abandon. That is where I am. Not at the end of the story, in the middle of what comes after the story, which is just life, continuing, with the changed shape of the things you have learned to carry without letting them be the only thing you are carrying. The house is mine, the credit is mine, the documentation is mine, and the decision about what comes next is mine. That is enough. That is actually exactly enough. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. Drop your city in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.